Hi, my name is Timothy Gager, and welcome to Virtual Friday's Dire Literary Series. And tonight, my guest is Joanna Rakoff. And what I would like to tell you and show you about Joanna is she's the author of the international best-selling memoir, My Salinger Year, and the novel, A Fortunate Age, winner of the Goldberg Prize for Fiction, the Elle Readers Prize, and the San Francisco Chronicle Bestseller. Rakoff's books have been translated into 20 languages and nominated for major prizes in the Netherlands and France. She's written frequently for the New York Times, Vogue, Marie Claire, the Oprah Magazine, and many other publications. So I am really excited to hear Joanna. And Joanna, what will you be reading from tonight?
So I'm going to read, actually, I think two very short scenes from the beginning of My Salinger Year. And for those who have seen the film, you'll be able to sort of see the way these were translated into the beginning of the film.
All right, I will leave the Zoom stage completely on to you right now.
Okay. And I feel like I have to explain that I left home without a copy of my book and today frantically attempted to get one and was unable to. So I'm reading this off my phone. So that's why I need my glasses. Okay, so this is basically not the very beginning, but almost the very beginning of My Salinger Year. There's a little coda that precedes this. We all have to start somewhere. For me, that somewhere was a dark room lined from floor to ceiling with books, rows and rows of books, sorted by author. Books from every conceivable era of the 20th century, their covers bearing the design hallmarks of the moments in which they'd been released into the world. The whimsical line drawings of the 1920s, the Dur mustards and maroons of the late 1950s, the gauzy watercolor portraits of the 1970s. Books that defined my days and the days of the others who worked within this dark warren of offices. When my colleagues uttered the names on the spines of those books, their voices turned husky and reverential, for these were names of godlike status to the literarily inclined. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Dylan Thomas, William Faulkner. But this was and is a literary agency, which means those names on the spines represented something else that leads people to speak in hushed voices, something that I had previously thought had absolutely nothing to do with books and literature. Money. Okay. And then a little bit of the first actual chapter, which is called 3 Days of Snow. On my first day at the agency, I dressed carefully in clothing that struck me as suitable for work in an office. A short wool skirt in black watch plaid, and a dark green turtleneck sweater with a zipper up the back from the 1960s, purchased in a London thrift shop. On my legs, thick black tights. On my feet, black suede loafers of Italian provenance purchased for me by my mother, who believed good shoes a necessity, not a luxury. I had never worked in an office before, but I had acted as a child, in college, and after, and I regarded this outfit as a costume, my role being the bright young assistant, the girl Friday. I paid perhaps too much attention to my dress because I knew almost nothing about the job that awaited me or the firm that had hired me. In fact, I still couldn't quite believe that I had indeed been hired. It happened so quickly. 3 months earlier, I had dropped out of graduate school or finished my master's, depending on how you look at it, and flown home from London, arriving at my parents' house in the suburbs with little more than an enormous box of books. I want to write my own poetry, I told my college boyfriend from the ancient payphone in the hallway of my Hampstead dorm, not analyze other people's poetry. I did not tell my parents this. I did not tell them anything other than that I felt lonely in London, and they, in keeping with our family's code of silence, asked me nothing about my plans. Instead, my mother took me shopping. At Lord & Taylor, she selected a suit, wool gabardine trimmed in velvet with a pencil skirt and a fitted vest, like something Katharine Hepburn wore in Adam's Rib, and a pair of suede court shoes. The hope, I realized, as the in-house tailor pinned up my sleeves, was that the suit would be a conduit to some sort of acceptable employment. A week before Christmas, my friend Celeste brought me along to a party where an old friend of hers spoke laconically of her job at the science fiction imprint of a large trade publisher. How did you end up there? I asked, less because I wanted the mechanicals of the hiring process and more because it struck me as strange that an English major with an interest in serious fiction would have taken such a job. By way of an answer, Celeste's friend pressed a business card in my hand. This is a placement agency, she told me. All the editors use them to find assistants. Give them a call. The next morning, I hesitantly dialed the number. Publishing had not been part of my plan, though, of course, I didn't have a plan. But the concept of fate appealed to me, a predilection that would get me into trouble soon enough, that it would take me years to shake. And I took it as a sign that I'd happened to get stuck in a corner with Celeste's friend, the two of us quiet and ill at ease within the raucous party. Can you come in this afternoon? When I was asked by the woman who answered the phone, her accent not exactly English, but containing notes of competent Englishness. And so I found myself, clad in my suit, handing over a hastily composed resume to an elegant lady in a skirt and jacket rather similar to my own. You just finished a master's in English, she asked, with a frown, her dark hair sliding into her face. Yes. Well, she said, sighing and putting my resume down. That will make you more appealing to some editors, less appealing to others. We'll find you something, though. She sat back in her chair. I'll give you a call in the new year. No one's hiring this close to Christmas. I'd barely made it home from her office when the phone rang. I have something for you, she said breathlessly. How would you feel about working at a literary agency rather than a publisher? Great, I said. I had no idea what a literary agency was. Fantastic, she said. This is a wonderful agency, an old, venerable agency. I think it's actually the oldest agency in New York. The job is with an agent who's been in the business a long, long time. She paused again. Some assistants have found her a bit difficult to work for, but others love her. I think you'd be a good match. And she's looking to hire someone right away. She wants to make a decision before Christmas. Later, I would discover that the agent in question had been interviewing potential assistants for months. But for now, on this cold day in December, I tucked the phone into my neck and hung my suit up in the shower to steam out the wrinkles. The next day, zipped and buttoned back into my suit, I took the train down to 51st and Lex, then walked across Park and over to Madison to meet with the agent in question. So, she said, lighting a long brown cigarette, a gesture that somehow reminded me simultaneously of Don Corleone and Lauren Bacall. Her fingers were long, slender, white, with non-existent knuckles and perfectly shaped oval nails. You can type? I can, I affirmed, shaking my head stiffly. I had been expecting more difficult questions, abstract inquiries into my work ethic or habits, challenges to the central tenets of my master's thesis. On a typewriter, she asked, pursing her lips and letting out frills of delicate white smoke. Ever so slightly, she smiled. It's very different from using her face went slack in disgust, a computer. I nodded nervously. It is, I agreed. An hour later, as the sky darkened and the city emptied for the holiday, I lay on the couch rereading Persuasion, hoping I'd never have to put that suit back on again, much less the stockings that went with it. The phone rang once again. I had a job. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you so much, Joanna. So I'm going to encourage people to put questions into the chat. But what was it like for you to see your life as a film? I know you wrote the screenplay for My Salinger Years. Was it emotional? Was it sense of accomplishment? Tell us.
It was both those things. I mean, it was very, very emotional. I'll sort of answer this question backwards. So I was very involved in the making of the film, from the very start. The director, who is sort of an auteur, his name is Philippe Falardeau. He's a French-Canadian director who had been making films, French language films, for years, when he was nominated for an Oscar and suddenly became a kind of Hollywood darling and had all these projects offered to him. And he took on My Salinger Year as his first kind of passion project. And when we met, I was actually talking to a whole bunch of other producers and directors, mainly producers. And he was the only one who came to Boston to meet me and who said, listen, if you just want to sell the rights and walk away, I'm not the director for you. You know, with me, if you go with me, you're going to be involved in every step of the way, from casting to set design to writing the script. You're going to be on set. And I thought about it and talked with my agent and decided that that was what I wanted, that this would, because this was a memoir, I knew that it would delay my next book being so involved, but because it was a memoir and because I felt very protective of the other people about whom I wrote, I wanted to be involved. I also had always wanted to work in film. I had actually worked in film before I went and got my MFA in writing and had thought about going into screenwriting. So anyway, the end of the story is that watching the film for the first time, I thought would not be particularly emotional. And I also thought that it wouldn't bring a huge sense of accomplishment because I had worked on the screenplay with the director for years at that point. You know, I had been really involved in the day-to-day making of the film. I'd been on the set for a week. And that had been very emotional, you know, watching the actors, you know, portray me and my boss. And honestly, it was more watching the actors read the words that I wrote that was very emotional. And so when I saw the final cut for the first time, which was in a 1,700 person theater in Berlin, right before lockdown, the film opened the 2020 Berlin Film Festival. And I decided to wait to see the final cut until the premiere. So I saw it, you know, sitting next to Margaret Qualley and one away from Sigourney, and my husband, Kirill, who's a character in the film, is right in back of me. And I, you know, it was unbelievably emotional. I mean, I was kind of crying throughout the whole film and just overwhelmed. You know, I felt shell-shocked when I left. And I was, of course, supposed to go to this huge, lavish party, and I just wanted to go home and kind of be quiet because I was so overwhelmed with emotion and a sense of accomplishment, a sense of, you know, I was a large part of this film that people are kind of loving. Like, people were laughing and crying, and I was like, I did this. So.
Did you even get to, for example, say that Sigourney Weaver did not catch your boss's like certain quirkinesses? Did you get to cut in or talk to the director about things such as that?
When I was on set, actually, what happened was more that Sigourney and Margaret went, like, you know, they would do a scene, and then Philippe, the director, would, you know, say, okay, now do it this way. Like, how are you feeling? And would sort of ask them questions and give them direction. And they just kept turning to me and saying, Joanna, what do you think? What do you think? Margaret kept saying, you know, how did you feel in this moment? What was it like for you? What would, you know, how did you feel as you said this to her? And Sigourney kept turning to me and saying, what do you think? What would Phyllis, that was my boss's real name, what would Phyllis have done? You know, how would she have worn this sweater? What would she have said here? How would she have reacted? So there wasn't much of my like sort of correcting things, but there was a lot of them consulting me. And some of the actors actually consulted with me before we went into production. And Margaret Qualley, who played me, did not consult me. I was thinking she might, because she was playing me. But I found out when I got on set that she had read every book that was mentioned in My Salinger Year. And there are a lot of, you know, that I mentioned as reading myself or liking. And there are a lot of books mentioned, and she read them all. And she also read every interview with me and profile of me that she could find, and then read all the books I mentioned in interviews. And she watched videos of me to sort of see what my mannerisms were like and how I held myself. So she had done a lot of research. And I honestly didn't feel a lot of need for correction. There were things that I wish I could have corrected, but they were not things having to do with Margaret or Sigourney's portrayal of those characters.
After doing all that legwork, did she end up correcting you? That's what I want to know.
No, not so much.
Great question by Barbara. Were there any scenes in the film that weren't part of the memoir?
Yes, there were. So we, went into this, Philippe and I, knowing that we would have to fictionalize things. And I think Philippe was actually surprised at how amenable I was to this. But I, am a person who, first of all, I have a lot of friends, the most famous one being Cheryl Strayed, who've had books adapted for film. So I know that they always have to be fictionalized in some way. And the same way that in a memoir, you do actually have to kind of, in some ways, fictionalize your life, because if you didn't, the book would be 10,000 pages long. Like, you can't contain everything. I couldn't contain every single thing that happened to me in a year. So in a film, things are even more kind of compressed, and you kind of have to build an arc even more dramatically and completely than you do in a book. And you also have to kind of make things that are internal external. So you have to kind of turn internal turmoil and internal meanderings of, a character's brain. You have to turn those into external conflict. And so My Salinger Year had a decent amount of plot. Like, it's a pretty tight, small book, which I think is why there's a lot of feeling that it could be adapted pretty easily into a film. Like, a longer book is harder, and it lends itself more to like a limited series or that kind of thing. But over the years, we kept sort of like adding in little bits more of fiction. So part of the reason I read what I did for you is because anyone who's seen the film might recall like how the scenes that I just read are portrayed in the film. They're portrayed like in a very stylized way. And what happens is that actually the kind of headhunter woman instructs me, the me character, tells her that the agent is going to ask her if she can type, and she has to just lie and say yes. And, and she says to her, of course you can't type. No one your age can type. And so this conversation actually did happen. And that scene came out of Philippe and I just talking and talking and talking about all the things that had happened. Like, it was almost as if he was like a therapist. Like, he would say, tell me what else happened. Like, there's just this very brief conversation with the headhunter. Like, is there anything we can use? And so what the headhunter says is kind of an amalgam of like some things she actually said to me, fiction, and then some things that my boss actually said to me in the interview, and we kind of compress those into one thing. But then there are some areas that are just total fiction. So in the movie, Joanna, I'll just talk about myself as a character, which is always weird, but what else are you gonna do? Joanna goes down to DC to kind of chaperone a meeting between Salinger and the owner of a small press who is potentially going to publish a standalone version of his last story, Hapworth. And then she also sees her college boyfriend, who is now my husband, Kirill, and who's a musician. He's in the film, he's a clarinetist. In real life, he's a violinist and a composer. Though he does play like 20 instruments, but he didn't play the clarinet and perform the clarinet as he does in the film. So that in and of itself is fictionalized. And Kirill was like, why didn't they make me a clarinetist?
They use that one.
I think there's one of the reasons is that clarinet is like a pretty easy instrument to learn. And so there was a feeling that like they couldn't like hire an actor and be like, learn the violin in 3 weeks, but they could be like, maybe learn the clarinet well enough to play a simple tune. So anyway, so in real life, I did not go down to DC and chaperone this meeting. That did not happen. And I did not see Kirill there. I did see Kirill at similar concerts. not actually during that year, but like right after that year. And we did have the kind of tearful, emotional reunion that we have in the film. So we kind of took a thing that really happened actually in New York at Carnegie Hall and put it in the film, because the plot line, there's a plot line in the book and the film having to do with Kirill, my college boyfriend, and my kind of longing for him, and I've broken up with him, which I explain in the pages right after what I just read. I broke up with him. I didn't really even understand why I was breaking up with him. I just kind of left him, and I'm like angry with myself, and I started dating this guy who's kind of his opposite, who's like a boxer and very macho and bossy and misogynist, though no one's used that term at the time. And it's not clear, like, am I dating him because I'm punishing myself about Kirill? Or like, did I just need to date someone like that in the way that, I don't know if this reference will mean anything to you, but in the way that like Rory Gilmore has to break up with Dean and date Jess. I'm seeing by your faces, you have no idea what I'm talking about, so you can just forget that. I think this may be a generational reference that makes no sense to you guys. Anyway, so there was a strong feeling that this plot line involving my college boyfriend had to be in the movie, and which I felt, the director at certain points wanted to eliminate it, but Margaret Qualley felt very strongly that it had to be in there, and the producers did as well. And so in the book, I'm mainly like thinking about him, and he writes me a letter that I don't open, and it's all sort of happening in my head and in flashback. But in the film, we had to have something really happen, and you had to kind of see these two people who are deeply in love. And so we had to find a way to externalize it. So what we did was we have her go down and see him, and then there's also a kind of fantasy sequence, and there's also her talking on the phone with him.
It's interesting how that certain things happen that were fictionalized. Now your novel, A Fortunate Age, takes place in the 90s in New York, and the character seems to be loosely based on you, works at a publishing house. So is there truths in the novel that are also intersect with the memoir?
That's a good question. The character that you're referring to, Sadie Peregrine, is not really, everyone assumes that I'm Sadie Peregrine. And I get that. Like, I think that like my sort of public persona is very Sadie Peregrine like I wear ladylike clothing, and my, I like have a sort of like prep school girl demeanor. But my mother, everyone that knows me, Sadie Peregrine's mother has a lot of crossover with my mother. But I'm not actually Sadie Peregrine. I've never worked at a publishing house, actually. I worked at this one agency, and then I left to become a writer, actually. I did work part-time at another agency for a couple of years, but I wasn't super invested in it in the way that I was invested in this job, because I was in grad school. I was getting my MFA at Columbia at the time, and for me, it was just a job. I took the job because I was like, I know how to do this. Like, I had this year at this agency. I know that I can do this in my sleep. So I'll make very little money for a couple of years, like a proper grad student. So, I'd say that A Fortunate Age really plays out on a kind of broad stage. It follows a bunch of characters, and Sadie a little bit as the main character, but I feel equally invested in all the characters in a way. But I'd say that there is a fundamental truth at the heart of both of them that is identical, which is that both are books about what it means to be a young woman on your own in a very difficult and expensive city, the city that is supposed to sort of launch the dreams of young artistic people. And so I feel like I started writing A Fortunate Age out of a desire to write truthfully about the vast economic changes of the 1990s and the way they affected the sort of tapestry of the city. But I was particularly interested in like the world that I knew, which was sort of people from various strains of the upper middle class, from like lower, absolutely no safety net, to, you know, someone like Sadie, who's like more upper, and who moved to the city to try to make it in, let's just say, artistic or bohemian fields. And because of, you know, basically the tech industry and the banking industry, which it would all, of course, collapse. You know, it was really like subprime mortgages that were fueling the economy at the time. So we know what happens after A Fortunate Age ends. So I really wanted to write about those economic changes and the way they affected the lives of young people and what that meant for the city itself. And My Salinger Year is basically about that as well. I also really wanted to write about what it really means to be a woman alone in a city. Okay. And because I felt like I started writing A Fortunate Age in 2002. I first started thinking about it in 2001. I think actually even earlier than that, but I started writing it in 2002. And I was a book critic at the time, and wrote a lot on publishing and a lot of like profiles of writers, but I was reading a very large volume of fiction. Like I was on the like debut women's novel beat because I was like a young woman. So that was all anyone would assign me. There was no like I eventually, in 2001, I got to write this huge long profile of Jonathan Franzen, and I had to fight for that. And it was only because at that time, like no one knew who he was or cared about him, that they let me do it. So anyway, so I kept reading these novels by young and youngish women, and they were all in this kind of like Bridget Jones's Diary sort of vein. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like I actually think that book is sort of brilliant in its own way. But what I mean to say is that there was no hint of the difficulty and the kind of darkness and like the scariness of being like a young woman living in New York or London or Paris or, you know, I don't know, Seattle, Chicago on your own. And like you can bear, you know, you have a job like at a nonprofit, at a publisher, at a theater company, you can barely pay your rent. Like you're eating ramen and like, you know, dried beans because you can't afford canned beans. And like you can't afford a cab and you're walking home by yourself late at night. And if by some chance, like you spend too much on dinner, then you can't afford to pay your rent. And, you know, I guess I'm going into such detail about this because I feel like I felt that I and my friends were often in situations that were dangerous and scary. And we were sort of told to just kind of like suck it up or like not think too much about it in a way that young women today are not actually told to do that. And I wanted to sort of write about what that was really like and the choices that women make because they're in these situations. Like one character in that book, you know, gets married basically because she's at the end, like she's out of gas. She has no money, you know, she's working 2 jobs. She has a sister who is mentally ill, who basically is kind of living with her. And so anyway, that was a much longer answer than you wanted, but
we got a lot of questions rolling in. I'd like to try to get to some of them. So Carolyn from Austin, Texas said, can you talk a bit about your relationship with Judy Blume and during your job at the agency or after, did you ever write a fan letter to her?
No, so I've never written a fan letter to Judy Blume. She, however, wrote to me after My Salinger Year came out. We sort of had a very brief correspondence in which she basically was saying, I'm dying to talk to you. And then in the year after it came out, we were at a literary festival together. Like we were both speaking at the festival, and she was introduced to me. I of course knew it was her, but I was too scared to go up to her. And she kind of took me aside and basically sort of explained what had happened from her side of the story, and it was fascinating to hear. And we've sort of just maintained a kind of like friendly relationship since then, though I do feel really concerned that she is upset about the actress that was cast to play her in the film, who like kind of looks nothing like her, and I was not consulted about it, and I was like, oh my God. So yeah.
Now, what on the set, did you ever yearn to be an actress yourself? Kevin's asking this.
I did. So yeah, so I, in my youth, like as a child and a teenager, even when I was in college, what I really wanted was to become an actor. I went to college, I went to Oberlin College, by the way, and I went there thinking that my parents were not going to let me major in theater, which is a little bit absurd because I actually went there on a National Merit Scholarship, so they weren't paying for my my tuition at all. And if you read my Salinger Year, you'll see that even my sort of like little
Oh no, we have Joanna is frozen. We'll give her a chance to come back. This has happened once before and it all worked. Questions. And one is the flowers that were used in the movie scene. Was during that scene, was that a real scene or
the flowers?
It was the scene where you went to your boss's house with flowers. Was that?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I was thinking like flowers.
I'm asking that question. Just.
So that was completely fictional, and that scene was actually Philippe, the director's idea. And I actually said to him, I would never have done that because she was such a sort of cool customer and had such extreme boundaries. And I just would have been scared to. But I could have imagined having the conversation that I had with her, but not actually going to her apartment. I did think about it. We talked about this. Like I kept contemplating it during this awful time for her. But yeah, that was completely fictional.
Okay, so for the last question, I'm really hoping, actually there'll be two more questions, but I'm really hoping that you watch this. Are you familiar with the adult cartoon BoJack Horseman? And when they portrayed, if you saw it, when they portrayed Salinger in that series on the show, Celebrities, Do They Know Things? What Do They Know? Was that taken at all from your research or your memoir?
So I'm familiar with BoJack Horseman, but I haven't seen that episode. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that question.
Oh, it's
now I have to watch it.
Yeah, and I'm wondering because it's about Salinger kind of coming back and being known as a celebrity. So I'm just wondering if, since you met him, if you could relate to it. So what are you working on now?
So now I'm working on a book called The Fifth Passenger, which is another memoir. It's very different in terms of subject matter from My Salinger Year, and also structurally because it kind of plays out over a much larger period of time, not just 1 year. And it basically, the basic premise of it is that I grew up believing that I had one sister who is 18 years my elder and with whom my parents had a very difficult relationship. And then basically when I was about to enter middle school, I found a photo and discovered that there were 2 kids in between us who, I wasn't told this straightforwardly, but it was clear that they had died before I was born. And I really never found out very much else about them or about what happened. I would sort of glean little bits and pieces of things. So what this book is it's basically me going back now as an adult and reporting out what happened. And the story is so much larger and very different, and has like political and sociocultural elements, and it's just very, very different than what I expected.
That sounds absolutely amazing. So like when you start to peel the onion skin, you must have found so much more in there.
Yeah, yeah, much, 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 much more. I mean, and some very, very dark things. You know, very dark things about my mother, actually. And just all sorts of things that I hadn't known actually about the town that I'm from, which is a small town in the Hudson River Valley called Nyack. And I, you know, had known a little bit about it, but I found out a lot about sort of like the history, which actually plays into the book. And also just the sort of unrest that was happening there in the 70s.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being a guest at Virtual Fridays Diary Literary Series. Here are the books that Joanna has discussed. Is there a favorite bookstore, an indie bookstore that people can order online or go to?
Oh God, I have so many. I mean, my local bookstore is Porter Square Books. I sort of live I live closer to Porter Square Books, but I also live very close to the Harvard bookstore, so you can order online from them. But I also love, I really love Books and Books in Miami is a favorite bookstore of mine. So thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop the live stream on Facebook right now. And anyone that viewed on Facebook, thank you for viewing and come back soon or next week.